Good evening, everyone. Welcome to episode number 32 of Restitching the Tapestry. I don't know what this stupid dance is, but I'm going to keep doing it because I can. So it's so strange because I was just live streaming a day ago, so it feels like deja vu, I suppose. But it's really good to see all of you. We're happy to be back for this episode. We've been wanting to do an episode on LGBTQ plus baiting for a long time, and we finally penned it in to our schedule. And we're going to have a really interesting conversation tonight because there's a lot of ground to cover with this topic. So before we get started, Ari, how are you doing?
I am so sleepy. I fell asleep before dinner, and but I am super awake for this topic. I am on fire. I am ready to talk about this topic. I am guns blazing, ready to go.
See, my tea is the thing that's getting me by because I've been like partially a zombie all day today. Um, I know I told Ari this some time ago, but I switched medications. So the new medication is kind of like I have moments throughout the day where I will be super like energetic doing something, and then like snap of a finger, I'm like Rip Van Winkle raising from a 20-year sleep. It's ridiculous. Our lives.
It's true.
So, of course, before we get started with our episode, I do want to be sure that I'm bringing up the episode really quick on YouTube so I can make sure everything is working okay. But I'm going to read our show's mission statement first, as we always do. So, many witness different atrocities, large or small, that fray the social fabric around us. And much of the time, many may feel powerless and know not how to address that. So this fray has gotten worse with the rise of social media, being able to share in trauma and having it go viral in real time, where everyone is able to kind of experience this trauma on a mass scale. And that often begs the question of what can we do to mend communities that are often the recipients of these tragedies. Most of these tragedies instigated or caused by privileged groups who don't know that they are actually involved. So our goal with this show is to restitch the social fabric of sorts through creating conversation, through creativity and action. I'm getting tongue-tied tonight. Can you tell that I'm a hot mess? And our whole goal with this show is to educate. And not only is our goal to help educate ourselves on things a little bit more, but our goal is to also help perpetuate that education, that knowledge to all of you. So Leo's like, y'all got to actually stitch an actual tapestry based on this show. If I had a stitching capability, I might do that. Wouldn't that be really cute if we had like a little stitched sign that said Restitching the Tapestry?
That would be cute.
Ari, do you do stitching?
I could try, but I don't know.
I don't. Well, if neither of us can do it, maybe I can commission a friend. I know a couple of friends that stitch. Maybe I can commission one of them to do it. And we can just like hold up a sign. Welcome, whenever we do an episode. Okay. So LGBTQ plus baiting. So for those of you who have not heard this term before, just to give a quick definition of it, essentially it is a marketing technique for fiction writers or entertainment or media where they, try to create or hint at LGBTQ plus characters, but may not always follow through with them, or they may follow through with very harmful stereotypes, so on and so forth. The goal is to appeal to LGBTQ plus audiences, for the financial rewards and so on and so forth of it. Ari, do you have anything to add to that definition that I might be missing?
It's true. They want appeal to the LGBTQ plus community while also appealing to homophobes at the same time. So it's kind of like this gotcha. So it's like, oh, we have this representation, but at the same time not hurting the sensibilities of homophobes.
Right. While also at the same time too, not alienating their overall audience. And it is commonly called queerbaiting, as Leo noted. We used LGBTQ plus baiting because the word queerbaiting, some people have argued that it doesn't include all communities. We really should open up the conversation to all of the communities, all people under LGBTQ plus. But commonly, yes, it is referred to as queerbaiting. So, I guess like before we get too far into talking about queerbaiting, I just wanted to introduce like the topic a little bit here. We do want to talk about a recent event, and that is the recent interview segment that Prince Harry did with Duchess Markle on that was facilitated by Oprah. So, Ari, do you want to share some thoughts on that?
I thought it was interesting. Wow, just wow. I feel like there are going to be some consequences for the crown. I'm not sure. I feel like there's just a lot of stuff that happened, but I don't know the consequences of this interview. Maybe nothing will come from it, but maybe something will come from it. But it was just a lot was said.
Yeah, it was a lot to process. And like I think a lot of people weren't really surprised that there were a lot of racist undertones hinted at by the crown, like facilitated by the crown and the institution surrounding it. But at the same time, I think I mentioned this in one of my recent videos, like I thought that the interview really opens up an important conversation about celebrity mental health, because a lot of people assume that being in a social class that means that the person's privileged means that they don't have to have any struggle with mental health or feeling trapped or anything like that. And I think that the interview proves that even people who seem like they're in a privileged position, they may be in a situation that is either unsafe for them or that's potentially limiting their access to things or limiting their freedoms in some fashion. So like I'm hoping that we do keep having conversations about it, because like my biggest worry is, and this happens a lot when it comes to discussions of the social justice variety, they often get swept under the rug when the new thing comes along, when the new thing that dominates the news comes along. So I guess here's hoping we just keep talking about it. So
I found it interesting that she wore Diana's tennis bracelet and she wore the Armani dress. I was like really stuck on that, like just how she was looking and the fact that she kept like holding her belly and like she was like just the way she was like posturing herself. Just I was like, it just I would I wasn't sure, like at first I was like I wasn't sure if they were doing it just because they had something to gain. But then when they started talking, I was like, well, maybe they have more to it than that. But I don't know. It's I'm a little up in the air about it. I feel like I don't know. I tend to stay out of royal matters because it's like I'm an American and
yeah, I get that.
It's not really my place to say about British matters. The British people will decide about their monarchy, but they know what's best, and I'm just an American.
Yeah, it's just really ironic and telling that both Prince Harry and Duchess Markle traveled to America to escape it. So so just catching up on the comments, because I know people have been commenting. Taylor's here, Leo's here, Rogue Agent Killer Rodan is here, Arby is here. Leo asks, can someone summarize what happened in the interview? I didn't get to see it. And Taylor does mention that it's free online streaming just with ads. Also, in that prior video that I did, I summarized it a little bit as well. So if you need to go back and watch that, that also is there. Taylor says that Whoopi Goldberg is the winner, to be honest. That must be something I missed. Could you summarize for me really quickly, Taylor, when you get a chance, what Whoopi Goldberg did that made her the winner? Because I do love me some Whoopi Goldberg. So, but anyway, we just wanted to touch on that really quickly because, as you know, we do like to nod at recent events, especially ones of that magnitude that really create that level of conversation. Ari, is there another one that you wanted to talk about too?
Oh, yeah, Kanye West's divorce from Kim Kardashian. Just because we were talking about mental health issues with Harry and the fact that, like, royals were dealing with mental health stuff and, how it was just really hard to be a royal and just the kind of amount of weight that they were dealing with. The fact that Kim Kardashian and Kanye West's divorce had broken up because of his mental health issues, it seemed like, that was something that was in the news recently, that they weren't they were also subject to something that was, something that people go through, and that's something that is very common in what I consider bipolar community. Is it'll be common in bipolar relationships that all of a sudden you'll have a bipolar episode and your marriage will dissolve because you can't maintain your relationships because you're not taking your medication, or you're not going to therapy, or you're just not compliant, and your partner just can't handle the stress of the relationship anymore. So it'll just fall apart and just dissolve away. And that's a pretty common theme that I've seen in my bipolar support groups, is that, well, I had another episode and my partner left me, and now I'm sad because my episode's over, and now I'm back to being stable again, and I just created this huge mess of a divorce.
Yep. Well, and the thing is, like, what's really interesting looking at celebrities who are going through things like this, so many people assume that they have access to mental health care, or they assume that because of their social influence that they would be, very much focused on getting care themselves, and that's not always the case either. I'm not 100% sure of Kanye West's background with his own mental health. I'd have to probably do more research on that.
He's been slowly deteriorating since the death of his mother. He was taking medication for a while there with his situation, but he said that it, quote unquote, deterred from his creativity. And he was going to a therapist for a while, but he said that he felt like he had handlers. So he stopped going to a therapist, and he stopped taking medication completely because he wanted to be free and have creativity and just go out there. And people were like, yeah, we're going to have another great album. And the fact is, like, this is really bad because Kanye West out there does some really like not so great things. Like
Mm-hmm.
he'll start going out all night and spending a lot of money and having really wild relationship problems and just firing people and having wild outbursts in public and screaming at the paparazzi, and you see him in public and he's just a mess. And that record's coming out, so it's got to be good because Kanye West is on his creative spin. And it's like, yeah, that's like the opposite of bipolar, is that you're really creative, but like
Mm-hmm.
the downs of bipolar are the fact that you're wild and you're a mess, and like you don't always make the best decisions, and like you're on a rampage.
Yeah. And what really concerns me is that him choosing to, I mean, obviously everybody makes a choice if they want to pursue medication and therapy or if they don't want to, but with a person who has this much social influence actively priding on, veering away from medication and therapy, like that also sends a message, to a lot of people who struggle, or to a lot of people who are, trying to understand their own mental health journey, that to create, they don't need the help, but really the truth is, if you need the help, you need to get the help, right?
And that's the problem, is that he's a role model to people with bipolar, that they shouldn't take their medication, and it's already hard enough for people with bipolar to take their medication. So someone who is like a role model, such as Kanye West, it's like, here's somebody who is an active member of the community who has bipolar, who's like very well known with bipolar, who is like actively not taking his medication, and people are like, well, he's doing fine, I don't have to take my medication. Kanye West doesn't take his medication, like I don't see what the problem is. And it's like, no, this
Yep.
is a bad role model to have.
Yep. And Leo, you make a good point in the comments too. Oh, and Taylor, I also saw the note that you put in about what Whoopi Goldberg said. But yeah, we just wanted to reflect on those two things happening, because it's, again, like, people with great social power are very influential, and it's important to reflect on those sphere of influences, those spheres of influence. Ignore my horrible subject verb agreement tonight. So let's move on to talking about LGBTQ plus baiting, okay, or queer baiting. We can use those interchangeably throughout this, but my first question for you, Ari, and this isn't a question that we have in the notes or anything like that, but when did you first discover that queer baiting is a thing?
It was in college. I was watching BBC Sherlock. I was on Tumblr. And all of a sudden, I was on Tumblr and people were shipping Sherlock and Watson. And there was a lot of talk about Sherlock and Watson being together, and a lot of like, aren't they really cute together? Shouldn't they be together? And like, this is really cute. And to a lesser extent, Supernatural with Dean and Castile. What was it?
Castiel.
Yeah, but it was
Their ship
Destiel.
name is Destio.
Destiel, yeah. I saw a lot of stuff about that too. but it was mostly Sherlock that I saw.
Yep. I remember saying that too.
So I was like, okay, what is this? And I was like, and then I read up on it, and like, I was like, oh, this is queer baiting.
Yep. Now, like, I don't think there's anything wrong with people shipping characters, but if you watch the shows or movies to see, like, what is triggering the queer, or not triggering the queer baiting, but triggering the ships, that's when you can determine, like, if it's, like, actual representation or if it's queer baiting instead. Sherlock definitely is an example of that. And I remember it did receive, well, after the fact, it
I mean,
received criticism.
it was like they were like living together, and like he like mourned his death, and like the fact that like Watson got married was so like cursory, and like his wife was like such a non-character. Like she was like so side character to the fact that like he and Watson were in this like back and forth together. They quibbled like a married couple, and like they got into like when they got together, they would just have this like relationship that just this dynamic that was just very like it was just so it was more than friendship. Like you could tell like the way that they talked to each other, it was just very like
like
it's more than just buddies. Like
the writing deliberately made it ambiguous for the sake of appealing to LGBTQ plus audiences.
it's definitely true. Like
Yeah.
But the fact that they like lived together in the same house, like, and they had that in the books, but the fact that they lived together in the same house, and like they were around each other all the time, like you don't live together and like not have some kind of relationship.
Yep. Well, and see, the thing is, queer baiting takes on so many forms in a way, and sometimes queer baiting almost creates the mirage of representation but doesn't. I have another example, and it's from one of my favorite shows. You know that I love Star Trek very much. Star Trek Deep Space Nine. It's a 90s spin-off series of Star Trek The Next Generation, and there is this character who, like, her alien species has like a symbiotic relationship with a parasitic being, and essentially when the parasitic being is placed in a new host, it retains like the memories and everything of all the prior hosts' relationships, so on and so forth. So there is an episode of Deep Space Nine where the character, her name is Jadzia, encounters the newest host of her prior lover's lover in a past life, and they are both women, and they kind of like they engage in this like kind of like fling relationship for an episode. But in this culture, it's taboo to kind of go back to prior relationships from past lives. So it's very people in the Star Trek fandom are very quick to be like, hey, it is representation. Like, it is, at least it's something. And in the 90s, maybe that was the case. Like, yeah. But looking back on it now, like, I do have the question of in my mind of like, did this age well in the grand scheme of things? And I would say that is queer baiting, because throughout the 90s, Star Trek was like, for being as progressive of a show that it is, one of the last things that it did not do was represent LGBTQ plus characters very well. So that was like their first kind of attempt at it. And again, for the 90s, that may have been good. But as an LGBTQ plus person myself, really wanting some sort of representation, that's kind of like just dangling a piece of bread over somebody who's starving. Like it's not
It's true.
like
We're so hungry for representation that it's like any sort of like representation, like any hint of representation.
right. So Rogue Agent Killer Rodan asks the question of, what are your thoughts on writing a gay story being inspired by an actual character from a show, movie, comic, or video games? So you're asking, like, what do we think about like taking a character that we may not know what their identity is and turn it into a same-sex relationship or non-binary relationship? I guess it would really depend on the writing for me. Like making so it would be like a fanfic. Is that my understanding?
So like making your own making a a character from a movie or a show like gay.
Okay.
I don't care. I think that that's fine. I think that
Taylor brings up a good point right here. Queer fetishizing is a result of a lot of this. Like that's where I'm going to circulate back and just say that it's entirely about the writing, because when you're reading something, you can definitely tell, at least I can tell, if there is queer fetishizing happening, or if there is like a genuine wholesome story happening with thoughtful development and meaningful representation, right? So go ahead, Ari.
I think it's just because like we're so hungry for representation sometimes, like that sometimes you need to like make characters gay because it's like, you know, it used to be that we had to do stuff like that because there weren't very many people who were gay at all. So it's sort of a leftover from that. I mean, it's less likely now because there are more gay characters, so we have more representation, but it's still kind of like there's still not enough representation, like as much as I'd like. So I mean, that's why I think it's fine, because it's like
I mean, I think it's pretty fine too. And honestly, I would be ridiculous to say that it's not fine because I've written stories like that in the past. It would be very hypocritical of me to say that. Rogue Agent Killer Rodan says, not a fan fiction per se, just your own story entirely, just inspired by a couple of characters. Yeah, I think that would be fine. I don't think that would be negative necessarily. So I do have a funny confession. My first story, my first fanfics that I used to write. I'm a huge fan of Dragon Ball Z, which is an anime. I don't know if you've watched it, Ari, or have heard of it.
I watched all of Dragon Ball Z. I used to have the Frieza series on tape.
My first crush, one of my gay awakenings, let's just say, was the character Trunks in Dragon Ball Z.
Of course he was with the purple hair.
Yep. And he had a sword, and I was just like, Well, I used to write fanfics placing myself in a relationship with Trunks, and like we lived happily ever after fighting bad guys together. And it was super romantic. It was ridiculous. Like I found one of these stories like a year ago and I read it and it was really bad. Like I've really thought about doing like a dramatic reading just for fun. But anyway, I digress. There are a lot of comments and I need to catch up on comments. Ari, did you ever write stories like that, or am I the only one?
No, I don't think I wrote stories like that, but I wrote in my journal stuff like that.
That's fair, right?
Yeah.
Let's see. Um, Rogue Agent Killer Renan's like Goku, like characters from Dragon Ball Z. You know, like I know a lot of gay men specifically. Like there's a lot of like homoeroticism in Dragon Ball Z. Like I feel like one could write a paper about it. But anyway, I digress. So Leo asks the question of where's the line between representation and fetishizing, and how do you avoid kink shaming in that regard then? That is a phenomenal question. And I'm going to leave that up for a minute while we talk about this. So what do you think, Ari?
I think it's a fine line between representation and fetishizing, and I think it depends on the work itself. I think that like it's just kind of a gray area. For me, it depends on really showing care in the work with how you treat the characters and how you present the characters and how you present the story. Obviously, you're not going to make it a porn, and that would be fetishizing, or even a. But
well, building off that, because that's a good point. I really think that the writer has more responsibility than they kind of understand. I think it's the writer's responsibility to definitely convey the intent of what they're writing. Like if your intent is to write just a smutty fanfic where it's just nothing but sex galore, you know, that's fine. Like you can do that. Just convey that though, because I think if you lead your audience into thinking that they're going to get like meaningful, wholesome representation that is supposed to be fulfilling, and then you make the story just be all about that, that's like that could potentially be destructive. Like that actually, I'm gonna be honest, that happened with me. And because when I first got into fan fiction, all the fan fiction that I would ever read would be like really sexualized fan fiction. And that's one of the things that taught me when I was younger. I believed that that's all that gay relationships were at that time. And I think demonstrating audience awareness is very important as writers, because we have to think about what our stories do to our audiences and how they connect with those audiences. So that's why I think that the line between, and I'm agreeing with Ari for sure, why the line between representation and fetishizing is very fine. All right. But that line can be made more bold if the writer establishes in an author's note or some sort of explanation what their intent is in writing the story. That way, if a 14-year-old LGBTQ plus person is reading something wanting to see a well-rounded, you know, healthy representation of a gay person or another LGBTQ plus person, that they aren't led astray and inadvertently taught or conditioned to think of certain relationships in a specific context. Does all that make sense?
yeah.
I feel like I talked myself in circles. I apologize.
But you can have sex in a story and still have it be okay. Because
For
I
sure.
read an LGBTQ plus story, Red, White, and Royal Blue, which was a romance story, and it did have some mentions of sex in it, and it still was representation of
Oh
LGBTQ
yeah.
plus people.
And that's the beauty of it. There can be a balance between all of that. 100%. Yep. Taylor says, I love Omegaverse as much as the next trash, but it's probably because seeing men in vulnerable spaces women traditionally occupy is escapism for me. That's kind of escapism for me in a way too, because men are, if we look at stereotypes, men are not expected to be vulnerable at all. And as a person who has felt vulnerable, it feels good being able to see men in a vulnerable, space to know that it's okay for me to also be vulnerable, right? Let's see. Rogue Agent Killer Rodan asks, you guys have some really good questions, by the way. How about porn with a story? I don't mind seeing as long as there's context. I think that's fine.
But is it fetishizing?
If intent is conveyed for the context at the beginning, I would probably say no. But I think, again, that's it's like walking on glass in a way. Like, it's very like, it can give way and turn into something else if you're not careful, right? See, I find topics like this very interesting because there are two sides, and like, obviously we don't want to sexually shame people, but at the same time we don't want to misrepresent groups of people either.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So let's see here. So if we move on to other examples of queerbaiting, there is one extremely glaring one that I need to mention that's very much relevant in nowadays, and that is a bit of queerbaiting in the Harry Potter universe.
Oh, man.
I'm sure I'm going to get a million hate comments in doing this, because whenever I've done anything J.K. Rowling related, her warriors are very devout, of course. But I'm going to go on this explanation and saying that J.K. Rowling, who is the author of the Harry Potter series, multiple times has said that her character Dumbledore is gay and had some sort of intimate relationship with the character. I think the character's name is Grindelwald, and it's mentioned, but there is no reference to it in the book. There is no, like, it's like she's basically mentioned it as canon, but there is no like examples in the text really to look at.
It's so posthumous. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, and she said that to, of course, appeal to the LGBTQ plus community, because there are a lot of LGBTQ plus people who do love the Harry Potter series, and that's completely fine, right? But I think using those people who, again, are really craving some form of representation, but using them by kind of giving them this little crumb of being like, oh, this character's gay, like, I have representation. Like, I think that's a little concerning. Maybe she was thinking good thoughts while saying that. I don't know. Maybe she meant well. But I think when we open up wider conversations about representation, I think that is definitely queerbaiting, 1000%.
It's true, yeah. She definitely she did a lot of stuff like that, where she would add stuff posthumously, and that was kind of one of her more devious ads. But J.K. Rowling is trash, in my opinion, because she would do stuff like that, and she's still doing stuff like that to this day. She still tries to add stuff to the Harry Potter universe.
Not to mention, we could have a full conversation about the transphobia, but we would be, our butts would be torn open by the devout army, so.
Oh, whatever.
I know. Leo recommends everyone watch Sarah Z's video essay on stuff like this. It's very informative, and it talks about issues with queer baiting or LGBTQ plus baiting. Yes, I'm gonna have to check that out. And maybe if you can send that link to me at some point, I would greatly appreciate it. And then Taylor recommends just Gus Johnson's video, J.K. Rowling these days.
I think I've seen that one.
It sounds familiar to me. I think I have too. There have been several videos that I watched about all of that. So just see, like, and this is what really concerns me, because when you have really powerful social influencers like J.K. Rowling normalizing certain behaviors and stances on things, then the legion of people who idolize her will take it and run with it at the expense of the marginalized communities that said behavior or troubling stances impacts the most. So anyway.
And they'll take it as gospel and they'll go, oh yeah, it's representation. Isn't that great? Isn't it great what she said? And it's like, no.
Well, and the thing is, the people who are saying, well, it's representation, aren't you satisfied, are usually the people who aren't in those marginalized communities. Once in a while, I will stumble across somebody in the LGBTQ plus community who will say, like, quit being over dramatic about representation. But the people who typically say that are the ones who are conditioned by cisgender heteronormativity to think that. They are conditioned to, in a way, subliminally self-loathe to that extent, where they are willing to shame other LGBTQ plus people when they bring up conversations about representation. I've been meaning to make a video about that, but I have not done it yet. Consider that a sneak peek. So let's see. Yeah, Leo, if you want, you can post that link right here in the chat. I think, like, the chat after the video is finished, once it processes, will still display, so people will be able to click on that link. Let's see. Are there any other examples of queer baiting that you want to talk about, Ari?
Xena and Gabrielle from Xena Warrior Princess. That was like a classic one.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
Oh man. That was... I used to watch that show as a kid, and they had such... I would watch that show as a kid, and I couldn't quite get my mind around it as a kid. Like, it didn't quite make sense to me as a kid because I didn't quite see it. Mm-hmm. But as an adult rewatching those episodes, like, wow, they definitely had some serious, have you seen the episodes? And yeah, they definitely had a special...
It's been a long time since I've watched Xena Warrior Princess, but I definitely remember.
They had a special relationship. I was at Grand Canyon and I watched an episode, and they have a very special relationship. And she definitely saves her on several occasions. And they just go along like little pals. Just gal pals being pals.
It's interesting. When it comes to queer baiting, so much of it is in the writing. It's in the dialogue. It's in the actions.
Sometimes it's not even just in the actions. It's
Leo mentions, I thought it wasn't queer baiting, like it was obvious, and Xena even says they were soulmates later on in the show and even kissed a number of times.
I wasn't sure that they said they were soulmates, but they definitely, for a long time there, they definitely hint at a relationship where they are just not having a relationship, where they definitely didn't kiss, as far as I am aware of. But they definitely have some kind of relationship and don't.
The writers were very, if memory serves, keep in mind it's been a while since I've watched it, but the writers of that show were very careful to not directly label it as anything, because they didn't, like, in my understanding, they didn't want to alienate too many people because they have a large male audience. Like Xena Warrior Princess and Hercules and all those films in the 90s had a huge male audience. Okay.
Is that true that she was under a sleeping curse? I didn't see that episode, so I'm not sure.
I'd have to revisit it. I can't remember that specific episode either.
It's been a while since I've seen all of the episodes, so but my understand that makes sense though that they were under, but you have to understand that most people are more willing to accept certain things about women kissing than they are about men kissing. So they'll see that as being just harmless gal pals, and they'll still see it as like not being in a relationship than they will men.
Oh, yeah. And that's why, like, in the late 90s and early 2000s, you see a lot more representation of two women in a relationship than you would see two men in a relationship. I mean, Buffy the Vampire Slayer is the first one that I can think of. The relationship between Willow and Tara. I mean, it was kind of quickly thrown into the show, but over the course of time, they improved that representation. But again, like, there's been conversation about like stereotypes and how like certain stereotypes and tropes also reflect the toxicity of queer baiting. For example, in many different shows, LGBTQ plus characters either have they become like the villain character, or they end up being killed off in a show, or they end up having like severe trauma of sorts. And it's not to say that, you know, there aren't LGBTQ plus people who do have trauma. Of course, there are many. But when the representation, when all you see is that in media, like, that becomes a very important thing to discuss, right?
Because I think if you would, Xena asked if they were queer characters, I think they would have still said no. And I think that's the difference about that show, is like they said that they were soulmates and they did kissing. But I think that if you had asked the show's writers, or even them, if they said, are these gay characters, they would have said no.
Right. Not to mention, soulmate can have multiple different, you know, connotations too. Yeah. So another one that I do want to mention, oh my gosh, this one, I forgot about this one until the very last minute when I was going through the notes, and it angered me so badly. The latest Star Wars trilogy. Ari, are you familiar with the Star Wars films by any chance?
Yeah, I've watched the Star Wars films. I watched all of them, I think up until the most recent one. I think I didn't watch Rogue One.
Yeah, I don't think I watched.
Or I didn't watch Han Solo. That's the one I didn't watch.
One I didn't watch either. So, okay. The Star Wars, the newest trilogy, which is labeled the sequel trilogy, does pretty good things when it comes to representation for women. It does pretty good things when it comes to representation with regard to race, but LGBTQ plus representation was an incredible misfire. That it was not handled very well. So essentially, while the Star Wars films were coming out, like, the writers and directors would frequently make comments of like, there's going to be some sort of LGBTQ plus representation. I remember it being the topic of a lot of conversation, and a lot of it circulated around the characters Finn and Poe Dameron.
Oh yeah.
And they did certain things in scenes and in the writing where, like, you would kind of get the idea that they had a thing for each other. But at the end of the day, the representation that they threw into Star Wars was in I think the last movie, and it was two women as a couple kissing during a battle.
And then they had Poe going off with a woman, the biggest cock block in history.
Like, I'm just like, I go back. I recently watched those films, and I'm just like, wow, that is so much good could have come from it, but it was an incredible misfire. And I have a very distinct feeling, and I know this isn't confirmed yet, this is just speculation, but I bet you they were planning on something more, but they were getting a lot of retaliation from Star Wars fans, because as much as I do love the Star Wars fandom, it can be very divisive when it comes to representation.
Oh, it was just so disappointing. I was just like,
Yeah.
I cannot believe this. That last film just was so disappointing.
Yeah. Yep. It's just like,
And
wow, okay.
somebody who did kiss in that last movie that shouldn't have kissed was what's his name? And the main female.
Oh, Kylo Ren and Rey.
Yes, Kylo Ren and Rey.
That was so confusing. Like, I was like, what's happening?
No, yeah. Manic Pixie Dream Boy.
Oh my goodness. But yeah, like it just I don't know. It just speaks loudly, I think.
It does, yeah.
I think that pretty much touches on all of the examples that we had in our notes.
I think it is, yeah. Do you have any examples of queerbaiting, you guys?
Yeah, like if you guys can think of any examples, any additional examples, feel free to put them in the chat and we can talk about them. Keep in mind, if it's a franchise that we're not familiar with, we might ask you to elaborate a little bit. So while you're doing that, we do have some discussion questions that we wanted to note. One question that we had is, why would they want to hint at queer representation at all if they're not going to depict it? And I think we kind of already answered that question in a way. The truth is they want to appeal to the LGBTQ plus audience, you know, for the financial aspect of it. And I think in some way they think that by appealing to those audiences, they are, you know, trying to create representation, but it kind of fizzles out into this thing that isn't really meaningful. But they do that in order to, like I said before, to avoid alienating their primary audience. So they'll like give us a crumb, but not a full meal. So they don't.
And it seems ridiculous because I feel like that the community would, you know, kind of turn up to it, like they would wake up to the fact that they're being kind of duped, and that they would start boycotting media like that. But it seems like, you know, they're so hungry for representation that they'll keep like, oh, at least it's something, or like, at least I'm getting. Oh, and we talked about Bridgerton. Did we talk about Bridgerton?
Oh my gosh, we did not talk about Bridgerton. Ari, take it away with Bridgerton.
So just recently on Bridgerton, although I am obsessed with Bridgerton, and
I do love Bridgerton too.
and this is what I'm talking about. We're so obsessed. We'll love shows and we'll love the way shows are, but they'll have that one crumb of LGBTQ plus representation. Henry Granville, he was a gay character. He had all of 3 lines, and he was a gay man who had an understanding with his wife, and one of the Bridgerton boys walked in on him having relations with a man, and oh, so shocking. He had relations with a man in 1800s Regency. So it's quite shocking, but it was whisked away off the screen. He was gone, and he only had 3 lines on the show.
All I remember is it was a door closing.
And he was just gone. There was no speak of him again, no hint of him again. He was just gone.
Yep. I remember watching that, and I literally had to stop the show, and I was like, Like I turned to my partner and I was just like, here is queerbaiting 101. And then of course it's like, oh God, here we go, another lecture on, representation. But it's true. Like it's really like now that I am older and I've seen other good examples of representation, like I'm more wholesome with it, but I know that there are other people who may not be as exposed to other forms of representation. And that becomes really sad for those people because they're not seeing themselves represented. They're not seeing accuracy.
It's true. I mean, I think the only reason why Bridgerton did it is so they could go, ticked the gay box. I've got a gay character. Look at me. Aren't I representative? And it's like, he had 3 lines and you whisked him away. Like, that's not a gay character. Like, that's barely anything.
It's a placeholder, basically. And it not a very effective placeholder at that. So yeah, we definitely wanted to mention Bridgerton because I would argue that's one of the latest examples. So let's see. Why doesn't the LGBTQ plus community boycott media that has queerbaiting in it? And I think we kind of just answered that question as well. It's because we are so conditioned to just be satisfied with anything that we get.
It's true, yeah.
And people will still just watch whatever, even if it isn't wholesome, representation. So I know Rogue Agent Killer Rodan has to leave, but he also mentioned
you're not a bother, by the way.
Yeah, you're not a bother at all. I did read your comment about the fan fiction, like the Frozen fan fiction. Fan fiction can be really toxic sometimes. But like I think nowadays, like there are at least more frank conversations about queerbaiting because you see like there are some shows that really consciously re-examine their use of LGBTQ plus characters. And before we leave tonight, I'm going to mention a couple of really good shows that I think have really good LGBTQ plus representation. Ari, if you have any that you'd like to mention, we'll talk about that in just a moment too. So the next question that we wanted to pose is all of this just in the heads of LGBTQ plus people, or is it real? Is it just perception or more? Is denying it gaslighting the community? Or is it that 2 people can just be friends without it being more than that? That's a very good question. So I don't think it's in our heads, even though we are conditioned to think that by the people who don't want to have conversations about representation, by the people who have never had to worry about not seeing themselves represented accurately in media because they're so used to seeing themselves all the time represented. I do believe that there are 2 characters that can simply be friends and just be friends. But if there are great extents and great strides made by writers of shows or films that directly try to place those characters in some sort of hinted affinity for one another, then that kind of makes it a null point.
It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that it depends on the context, and I think that it's more than that. And I think that like there is a certain amount of like where you're kind of like you're kind of messing with your audience a little bit, where you're like, oh, they're just buddies, they're just pals, and it's like, wait a minute, like, are you? You're shitting me, right?
What is so destructive about that is because so many years LGBTQ plus people have had to relegate themselves as being friends so they don't make other people uncomfortable.
Right.
So like us having to see that joked about in media in a way or scoffed at, like that's really troubling. you know?
There's a joke that's goes around on Twitter or on TikTok that's like, and they were roommates.
Yes, I've seen that. Leo asks a very good question, and then we'll go to our final question. Leo asks, how do you personally differentiate between baiting and virtue signaling? Ooh,
Um,
that's a good one.
so virtue signaling is like where you're doing this because you want to show the community that you're doing showing representation as a way to make yourself look good, so you're showing accurate representation to the community. Baiting is where you hint at a relationship and you're not giving the community what it wants. So
Mm-hmm.
it's sort of the same thing but not quite the same thing.
Right. The intent is different.
Virtue signaling would actually be giving the community what they wanted and saying, look at me, aren't we doing the great thing? So it would be more of a more representation actually, but it would be kind of pompous.
Yeah, like it really is about like the context in which it's framed. So if like the creators frame it by like priding themselves like, oh, well, we got good representation, watch our show. And it
But
is good
it would be like
representation.
showing, wouldn't it be showing like gay people doing like stereotypical things like together that'd be like virtue signaling almost, like
Something along those lines, yeah. Like see, the thing is like it's a very like it's a spectrum in a way, because because I would also argue that queer baiting can also create toxic stereotypes. Buffy the Vampire Slayer has a lot of those. As much as I love that show, and I think that show did some really wonderful things for representation early on, like it did kind of queer bait in the sense that it really fueled itself with the stereotyping a lot. So our last question is, what happens when people argue that queer baiting is at least some sort of representation? And then I also pose, what's the line between queer baiting and representation? I would argue, like, if people ever tell me that queer baiting is at least some sort of representation, I try to coax them into thinking about what that crumb of representation is going to actually do. Is it going to help people feel like they're being represented and seen, or is it just going to perpetuate the negative stereotypes established by those who aren't a part of the communities? That's the question that I would usually pose in that context. What do you think, Ari?
So yeah, it is a fine line between baiting and representation. Well, not really. I think that, that representation is actually giving us what we want and showing the actual relationship and committing to the relationship and showing us what we need and actually giving the storylines and following through and going that extra mile and showing care to the community and doing the right thing and just being honest that this is a gay relationship, here's what it is, here's what we need, and just doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of just hinting at these storylines and not going anywhere, or doing side characters that don't matter, or just throwing crumbs off into the distance, like,
or a character that you get really invested in that ends up being killed off or goes insane, or anything like that, because that's something those are very common stereotypes.
Yeah,
those are very common tropes that we see.
Yeah, I hate that. That's another one I hate too.
Yeah. See, that's actually my issue with Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I know I've been going on and on about Buffy the Vampire Slayer only because it was seen as being very monumental with regard to representation. An LGBTQ plus relationship was introduced in the 4th season. It progresses all the way to the 6th season. It gets better and better and better. And then suddenly one of them gets killed off. The other one kind of loses her shit and almost destroys the world. And it's just like this really, like, it was this beautiful relationship that some, like, a writer took a crap on and then was like, hey, just kidding, let me tug at your heartstrings just for the sake of it, and ruin this relationship in a very spontaneous way. And it's not to say that, people can't die or people can't, lose themselves in something. But it's Joss Whedon. Like Taylor mentions, it's the director, Joss Whedon, and another show, Firefly, that he also directed, also has some of that too, which I've seen. So now that we are at the end of our episode, Ari, do you have any recommendations of shows or films that have good LGBTQ plus representation?
I don't know if it's good LGBTQ plus recommendations, but one show that I really like is Euphoria.
Oh, I've not seen that yet, I don't think.
It has to do with bipolar representation, and it has a gay character on it that's pretty good. She's in a relationship with another character. She's in high school. I don't know if they have a good relationship, but they do have a relationship. So,
that sounds like it's at least better than what we've seen before, right?
Yeah.
One of my recommendations is Schitt's Creek. I don't know if you guys have seen Schitt's Creek.
Oh, that's a good one.
Schitt's Creek not only was written and directed by somebody who is in the LGBTQ plus community, but plays a character in the show, and the character is, if memory serves, pansexual, so it creates really good representation for people who are pansexual. There is also representation for people who are polyamorous, so on and so forth. So there's like a lot of like good representation for relationships that don't often get a lot of positive media exposure, Another show that I have to recommend, of course, it's going to be a Star Trek one, Star Trek Discovery.
I was going to say that one too.
Yes, Star Trek. Oh my God. Star Trek Discovery. I cry over how beautiful the representation is.
Steven Universe too.
Steven Universe.
I love Steven Universe.
So see, there are good bits of representation out there. Like, I would just recommend, like, if you do end up watching a show and you know that there are going to be LGBTQ plus characters in it, try to do some a small amount of research that doesn't, spoil things for you, just to ensure that it is going to be good representation. So, Ari, do you have any parting words for tonight? Parting wisdom.
I wanted to say something funny, like, if you can't relate, don't queerbait.
That's perfect. That's what we're ending on. That is, I want to frame that. That's going to be one of our show slogans from now on. All right, everyone. Thank you again for tuning in for a wonderful episode. We really enjoyed your questions and your conversations. Subscribe to Ari's channel, Strange Nothings, if you haven't yet. Subscribe to mine if you haven't yet. Click like on the video, share it around, all that jazz. And we will see you next Friday. Bye.